Do you ever feel like you're standing on the edge of something that could change your life, but fear holds you back? Have you ever wanted something so badly, yet every time you try to reach for it, a voice inside tells you, you're not good enough? That was me. For years, I dreamed of learning English, of opening up doors to new opportunities, of connecting with people from all over the world, of seeing the world in ways I never could before. But every time I thought about it, fear took over. Fear of failure, fear of being laughed at, fear of embarrassing myself. I was paralyzed. But something changed. One day, I decided I couldn't let fear control me anymore. I took the first step, and what happened next transformed me completely. Not just in how I learned a new language, but in how I learned to face life. This is my story of how I went from fear to fluency, from doubt to confidence, and how English opened doors I never knew existed. For as long as I can remember, English had been more than just a language. It was a barrier. It stood between me and everything I wanted. Better job opportunities, the ability to travel, to connect with people, to belong. But every time I thought about learning it, I was consumed by a fear that felt like it was woven into the very fabric of who I was. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of standing out in the worst possible way. And so, for years I did nothing. I sat on the sidelines of life, watching as others leaped ahead, while I remained stuck, trapped by my own doubts. But there comes a time in everyone's life when they realize they can't keep living in the shadow of their fears. For me, that moment came one quiet evening. I was sitting in my tiny apartment, scrolling through social media. The posts I saw seemed to taunt me. Friends traveling abroad, taking jobs at international companies, effortlessly moving through the world. I felt a pang of envy so sharp it was almost physical. How did they get there? What did they have that I didn't? I knew the answer. English. Looking back, I can see that fear had ruled me for far too long. In school, I had always been the quiet one, the student who barely raised her hand, who never volunteered to speak in front of the class. My teachers used to say I was a good student, but I knew the truth. I was terrified. Terrified of saying the wrong thing, of being laughed at, of being exposed as someone who didn't belong. That fear followed me into adulthood. In my job, I kept my head down, avoiding any interaction that required speaking English. I watched my colleagues move up, get promotions, and take on exciting new projects, while I stayed where it was safe, hidden in the background. I didn't mind it at first. I told myself that I was happy staying in my lane, that I didn't need more responsibility or recognition. But over time, that safety began to feel like a prison. The world outside seemed bigger and more inaccessible than ever before. Every day, I felt the walls closing in. I would hear conversations in English, on the street, in coffee shops, in the workplace, and I'd feel that familiar tightening in my chest. I didn't belong in that world. It was for other people, not me. But at the same time, I couldn't help but dream about what it would be like to speak confidently, to travel without fear, to have conversations with people from different countries and backgrounds. Then came that night. As I sat scrolling through my phone, I stumbled upon an interview with someone I had gone to school with. She had learned English years ago and was now working for an international company, traveling the world, and living the kind of life I had always dreamed about. She talked about how hard it had been at first, how she had struggled with self-doubt, how she had made countless mistakes. But she also talked about the moment it all clicked, the moment she realized that it wasn't about being perfect, but about trying, about showing up, about pushing past the fear. As I listened to her speak, something inside me shifted. I realized that the only thing standing between me and the life I wanted was me. I had been holding myself back, letting my fears control me. And for what? To stay comfortable? To avoid embarrassment? To avoid failure? But wasn't I failing anyway by not even trying? That was the moment everything changed. I decided then and there that I was done letting fear run my life. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew one thing for sure. I was going to learn English. I wasn't going to wait for the right time, for when I felt ready, for when the fear went away. Because the truth was, I was never going to feel ready. The fear was never going to go away. I had to move forward despite it. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I grabbed the brochure I had picked up months ago from a local language school and dialed the number. My hands were trembling as I waited for someone to pick up. Part of me hoped they wouldn't, that I could just hang up and go back to my old life, my safe life. But then, a voice came on the line. "Hello, how can I help you?" I froze. For a split second, I almost hung up. But then I heard myself speaking, almost as if it were someone else. "Hi. I'd like to sign up for English classes," I said, my voice shaking. The person on the other end was kind and patient. She walked me through the process, asked me a few questions, and signed me up for my first class. It all happened so quickly that by the time I hung up the phone, I could hardly believe it. I had done it. I had taken the first step. For the rest of the day, I was a bundle of nerves. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, wondering if I had sounded stupid, if I had made a mistake. But then I reminded myself that the hardest part was over. I had taken the leap, and now all I had to do was show up. The day before class. In the days leading up to my first class, the fear didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. I had nightmares about standing in front of the class, unable to speak, my classmates laughing at me. I imagined myself fumbling over words, making a fool of myself. Every time I thought about it, my stomach churned with anxiety. Part of me wanted to back out, to call the school and cancel. But I knew I couldn't. I had already come this far, and I wasn't going to let fear stop me again. The night before my first class, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with all the things that could go wrong. What if I was the worst in the class? What if I couldn't keep up? What if I embarrassed myself so badly that I could never show my face again? But then as I lay there, something strange happened. Amid all the fear and doubt, a small voice inside me said, "What if it goes well? What if this is the beginning of something amazing?" I held on to that thought as tightly as I could. The first class. The next day, I walked into the classroom feeling like I was going to my own execution. My hands were sweaty, my heart was pounding, and my mind was racing with all the things that could go wrong. As I walked in, I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact with the other students. I found a seat in the back of the room, hoping to disappear into the background. Our teacher, Mr. Harris, greeted us all with a warm smile. He introduced himself in simple English, his voice calm and reassuring. "Welcome," he said. "I know many of you are nervous, but I want you to remember one thing. We're all here to learn, and that means making mistakes. There's no such thing as perfection in this class, only progress." His words were meant to be comforting, but they did little to ease my anxiety. I glanced around the room, noticing the other students. Some of them looked confident, like they already knew what they were doing. Others looked just as scared as I felt. It was a diverse group. People from all over the world, all with different reasons for being there. But despite our differences, we all had one thing in common. We were here to learn, and we were all starting at the same place. The first exercise was simple. Introducing ourselves. Mr. Harris asked each of us to stand up, say our name, and explain why we wanted to learn English. I could feel my heart racing as my turn approached. I had rehearsed what I was going to say over and over in my head, but now that the moment was here, my mind went blank. When Mr. Harris called my name, I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. My name is your name," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. I want to learn English because I need it for my job." The words felt clumsy and awkward, and I could feel my face burning with embarrassment. But Mr. Harris didn't react with judgment. He nodded, smiling kindly. "Thank you for sharing," he said. "That's a great reason to learn English." I sat back down, my heart still racing, but the worst part was over. I had spoken. It wasn't perfect, but I had done it. As the class went on, I felt a little more at ease. The other students were kind, and I began to realize that everyone was struggling in their own way. We were all making mistakes, stumbling over words, and trying to find our way. But we were also learning, and that was what mattered. After the introductions were over, Mr. Harris began to explain the course structure. He spoke slowly, using simple words that we could understand, but I still found myself struggling to follow every word. My brain felt like it was working overtime, trying to translate each sentence into my native language and then back again. I could feel the other students around me nodding, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting it, while I was already falling behind. "Don't worry if everything doesn't make sense right away," Mr. Harris said, as if reading my mind. "It's normal to feel overwhelmed in the beginning. Your brain is working hard to adjust to a new way of thinking, but trust me, it gets easier with time." His words offered some relief, but I still couldn't help feeling like I was in over my head. After all, it wasn't just about learning a few new words or phrases. It was about rewiring my brain to think in an entirely new language, something that felt almost impossible at the moment. As the class continued, we moved into simple exercises. Mr. Harris asked us to form pairs and practice a short dialogue using basic greetings. My partner was a young woman named Maria, who had a soft accent I couldn't quite place. She smiled at me warmly, and I felt a little of the tension in my shoulders ease. "Hello, how are you?" she said in slow, careful English, just as Mr. Harris had instructed. I'm fine, thank you, I responded, stumbling over the words even though they were some of the simplest phrases in the language. Maria smiled again, encouraging me. You did great, she said, this time in her native language, sensing that I was struggling. I understand how you feel. I was so nervous my first day too. Her kindness was like a balm for my anxiety. It was the first time that day that I didn't feel completely alone in my fear. I smiled back, grateful for the brief moment of connection. After class ended, I gathered my things and left quickly, eager to escape the overwhelming feelings that had consumed me for the past 2 hours. As I walked home, I replayed the day in my head, focusing on every mistake I had made, every moment where I had struggled to find the right words. I felt heavy with self-doubt. The initial excitement I had felt that morning had been replaced by a gnawing sense of inadequacy. I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a mistake by enrolling in the class. What if I wasn't cut out for this? What if I just wasn't good enough to learn a new language, especially one as complex as English? The more I thought about it, the more the fear crept back in, whispering in my ear, "This is too hard. You're not ready. You'll never be able to do this." By the time I reached my apartment, I was completely deflated. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall. I could feel tears welling up in my eyes, and I didn't try to stop them. The weight of my own insecurities was crushing me, and for a moment, I considered calling the school and dropping out of the class. It would be easier, after all, to just quit now before I embarrassed myself any further. But then, something strange happened. Amid the wave of self-doubt, a small voice inside me spoke up. It was faint, but it was there. What if you didn't quit? What if you just kept going, even though it's hard? The thought lingered, pushing back against the fear. I knew I couldn't give up after just one day. If I gave in to my doubts now, I would be right back where I started. Stuck, afraid, and full of regret. So, I made a decision. I wasn't going to quit. No matter how hard it got, I was going to see this through. The next few weeks were some of the hardest of my life. Every class felt like a battle. I would sit there, trying to follow along as Mr. Harris explained new grammar rules or introduced new vocabulary, but my brain always seemed a step behind. While some of the other students raised their hands and participated confidently, I stayed silent, too afraid to make a mistake. I often felt like I was walking through a fog, straining to see clearly, but never quite able to grasp the full picture. The words blurred together, the rules seemed impossible to memorize, and no matter how much I studied outside of class, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't getting anywhere. At night, I would lie in bed, mentally going over everything I had learned that day, repeating phrases to myself in the dark, hoping that if I said them enough times, they would finally stick. But the more I tried, the more frustrated I became. My mind was a jumble of English and my native language, and nothing seemed to make sense anymore. It was during these nights that the doubt crept in again. "Why are you doing this?" The voice would whisper. "You'll never be as good as the others. You're just wasting your time." Every time the doubt surfaced, I would have to fight it back, reminding myself why I had started this journey in the first place. I wanted more from my life. I wanted the freedom that came with speaking English, the ability to communicate with people from all over the world, to travel without fear, to pursue job opportunities that had always been out of reach. But most of all, I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it, that I was capable of overcoming this fear that had held me back for so long. It wasn't all bad, though. Amid the struggle, there were small moments of progress that kept me going. One evening, I was walking home from class, replaying the day's lesson in my head, when I passed a group of tourists who were speaking in English. Normally, I would have just walked by, tuning out the conversation because it was too difficult to understand. But this time, something was different. As I listened, I realized I could understand what they were saying. Simple things like asking for directions and talking about their plans for the day. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me stop in my tracks. For the first time, I felt like all the hard work was starting to pay off. I could actually understand English in a real-life situation, without needing to translate every word in my head. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. That night, I went home with a renewed sense of purpose. I realized that even though the progress was slow, it was happening. I was getting better, little by little, and I couldn't let the setbacks overshadow the small wins. In the following weeks, I began to open up more in class. I still wasn't the most confident student, but I started participating in group activities and even volunteered to answer a few questions during class discussions. It was terrifying at first, but every time I spoke, I felt a little less afraid. I also began forming friendships with some of my classmates. Maria, the woman I had paired with on the first day, became my closest ally. We started sitting together in class, and after each lesson, we would grab coffee and practice speaking English. She was incredibly supportive, and her encouragement made all the difference. "You're doing great," she would say after I struggled through a sentence. "I can see how much you're improving." Her words were like a lifeline, pulling me out of the pit of self-doubt that I often found myself sinking into. It helped to know that I wasn't alone in this journey, that we were all struggling in our own ways, and that the fear of making mistakes wasn't something I had to carry by myself. As the weeks turned into months, something began to shift. It wasn't a dramatic change. There was no sudden moment where everything clicked into place. But slowly, gradually, I started to feel more comfortable with the language. The words that had once felt foreign and awkward began to roll off my tongue with a little more ease. The sentences that had once jumbled together in my mind started to make sense. One day, Mr. Harris asked us to pair up for a role-playing exercise. We were supposed to practice ordering food in a restaurant, taking turns being the customer and the waiter. Normally, I would have dreaded this kind of activity, but something inside me felt different this time. Instead of shying away, I embraced the challenge. When it was my turn to play the customer, I took a deep breath and began. "Hello," I said to my partner who was playing the waiter. "I'd like to order a salad, please." It was a simple sentence, but as soon as the words left my mouth, I realized something. I hadn't hesitated. I hadn't stumbled over the words or second-guessed myself. I had just spoken. Chapter 2. The Fear of Failure. The fear of failure had always been my shadow, following me everywhere. Every time I walked into the classroom, It was there, whispering in my ear, "You can't do this. You're going to embarrass yourself. You'll never be as good as the others." It was exhausting. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, the fear stayed with me, weighing me down like a heavy cloak. There were moments, especially in the early days, when the fear almost convinced me to quit. After each class, I would replay the day's mistakes in my head, obsessing over every mispronounced word, every grammar mistake, every moment where I had failed to understand what Mr. Harris was saying. I felt like I was always behind, like I was trying to catch up to everyone else but never quite making it. A decision to stay. The decision to stay in the class wasn't easy. There were so many times when I wanted to give up, when I felt like it would be easier to go back to my old life, the life where I didn't have to constantly face my insecurities. But every time I thought about quitting, I remembered why I had started in the first place. I remembered the feeling of being stuck, of watching life pass me by while I stayed in the same place. I remembered the envy I felt every time I saw someone effortlessly speaking English, and the way my stomach twisted when I realized that they were living the life I wanted. I remembered the deep aching regret that had followed me for so many years. The regret of not trying, of letting fear win. And so, I made a decision. I wasn't going to quit. No matter how hard it got, no matter how many mistakes I made, I was going to see this through. I was tired of running away from my fears. I wanted to face them, to conquer them. And if that meant struggling, stumbling, and falling along the way, then so be it. But even with my newfound resolve, the fear of failure didn't magically disappear. It was still there, always lurking in the background. And it wasn't just in the classroom. It followed me everywhere. Every time I tried to practice speaking English with a stranger, the fear would rear its ugly head. My palms would sweat, my heart would race, and I would feel like I was going to mess up in the most humiliating way possible. One day, I decided to challenge myself by ordering coffee in English. It was something I had been practicing for weeks, rehearsing the words in my head over and over again. I walked into the cafe, my nerves on edge, and waited in line, repeating the sentence in my mind, "I'd like a latte, please." It was simple. I could do this. I had to do this. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the counter, heart pounding in my chest. The barista smiled at me, and for a split second, I froze. The words were right there, but I couldn't get them out. After a long, awkward pause, I finally blurted out, "Latte, please." It wasn't smooth. It wasn't perfect. But I had said it. The barista didn't laugh. She didn't point out my mistake. She simply nodded and asked, "Would you like that hot or iced?" My mind went blank again. The panic set in, and I could feel the heat rising to my face. Hot," I mumbled, the word barely audible. I walked away from the counter feeling humiliated. It was such a simple interaction. Ordering a coffee, something that people did every day without thinking. But I had made it into a monumental task, and I felt like I had failed. I sat down with my coffee, staring at the cup, replaying the conversation in my head. Why couldn't I just do it right? Why was it so hard for me? But then, as I sat there wallowing in my frustration, I realized something. I had done it. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't smooth. But I had done it. I had spoken in English, and the world hadn't ended. I hadn't been laughed at or ridiculed. I had ordered a coffee, and I had survived. As the months went on, I began to realize that my fear of failure wasn't just about making mistakes in English. It was about something deeper, something that had been a part of me for as long as I could remember. I had always been afraid of failing, afraid of not living up to the expectations I had set for myself. It wasn't just about language. It was about my entire life. Growing up, I had always been the good student. I was quiet, obedient, and never caused trouble. My teachers praised me for my good behavior, for always following the rules. But beneath the surface, I was terrified. I was terrified of disappointing the people around me, of failing to meet the expectations that had been placed on me. And that fear had followed me into adulthood. It had shaped my choices, my decisions, and the way I lived my life. I had always stayed in my comfort zone, doing what was expected of me, never taking risks. Because taking risks meant opening myself up to failure. And failure was something I couldn't handle. Learning English had forced me to confront that fear head-on. Every time I made a mistake in class, every time I stumbled over my words, every time I misunderstood something, I felt like I was failing. Not just at English, but at life. I had built up this idea in my head that I had to be perfect, that I couldn't make mistakes. But now, I was beginning to see that perfection wasn't possible. I was going to make mistakes. I was going to fall short. And that was okay. One evening, after a particularly difficult class, I sat down with Mr. Harris to talk about my progress. I was feeling discouraged, like I wasn't making any headway, like I was constantly falling short of where I should be. I just don't feel like I'm getting any better, I admitted, my voice heavy with frustration. Every time I think I'm making progress, I mess up again. Mr. Harris listened quietly, nodding as I spoke. When I finished, he smiled gently. I think you're being too hard on yourself, he said. Progress isn't always about moving forward in a straight line. Sometimes, it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But that doesn't mean you're not moving forward. His words hit me hard. I had been measuring my success by impossible standards. Standards that didn't allow for mistakes, for setbacks, for the messiness of learning something new. I had been so focused on the moments when I fell short that I hadn't stopped to recognize the progress I was making. You've come a long way, Mr. Harris continued. Think about where you were when you first started. You were too afraid to even speak in class, and now you're participating, you're engaging with your classmates. You're speaking more confidently every day. That's progress. I hadn't thought about it like that before. I had been so caught up in the idea of failure that I hadn't allowed myself to see the small victories along the way. I had been so focused on what I wasn't doing right that I had completely missed what I was doing right. After that conversation, something shifted inside me. I began to change the way I thought about mistakes. Instead of seeing them as failures, I started to see them as opportunities. Opportunities to learn, to grow, to improve. I stopped beating myself up every time I made a mistake, and instead, I started to ask myself, what can I learn from this? How can I do better next time? It wasn't easy. There were still moments when the fear of failure crept in, when I felt the old doubts rising to the surface. But I had learned something valuable. Failure wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be embraced. Because without failure, there could be no growth. Without mistakes, there could be no progress. In the months that followed, I started taking more risks. I pushed myself to speak more, to engage more, to put myself in situations where I knew I might mess up. And yes, I made mistakes. Lots of them. But each mistake brought me closer to where I wanted to be. One day, I was walking through the park when I overheard a group of tourists speaking in English. They were lost, trying to find their way to a nearby museum. Normally, I would have just walked by, too afraid to offer any help. But this time I stopped. I approached them and said, "Do you need directions?" They looked at me surprised, but grateful. "Yes, please," one of them said. "We're trying to find the museum, but we're not sure which way to go." I smiled and pointed them in the right direction, explaining how to get there. My words were a little shaky, and I stumbled over a few sentences, but I didn't care. I had spoken. I had helped. And the tourists had understood me. As I walked away, I felt a surge of pride. It wasn't about speaking perfectly or not making mistakes. It was about communicating, about connecting with others, about using the language I had worked so hard to learn. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free from the fear of failure. Free from the pressure to be perfect. Free to make mistakes and learn from them. And that freedom was more valuable than any success I could have imagined. Chapter 3. Small Victories, Big Impact. After months of pushing through my fears and forcing myself to speak up in class, something amazing began to happen. I started to notice real progress. It wasn't huge, and it wasn't always obvious, but it was there. One day, I was in a local cafe, waiting in line to order my coffee. Usually, this would be a moment of anxiety for me. I would rehearse my order over and over in my head, worrying about getting the words wrong or misunderstanding what the barista said. But this time, something was different. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't overthinking. I simply walked up to the counter, smiled at the barista, and said, "I'd like a latte, please." The words came out naturally, without hesitation. It was as if they had always been there, waiting to be spoken. The barista smiled back and asked, "Would you like that hot or iced?" "Hot, please," I replied without missing a beat. As I walked away with my coffee, I felt a surge of pride. It was such a small thing, ordering a coffee, but for me, it was huge. It was a sign that I was making progress, that all the hard work I had been putting in was starting to pay off. As the weeks went by, I began to notice more and more moments like that. I started to understand conversations more easily, both in class and in everyday life. I was able to respond without having to pause and think about every word. I wasn't fluent yet, not even close, but I was getting better, and that was enough. One evening, I was walking home from class when I overheard a group of tourists asking for directions. They were speaking in English, and normally, I would have just walked by, too afraid to speak. But this time I stopped. I turned to them and said, "Do you need help?" They looked at me, surprised but grateful. Yes, thank you. We're trying to find the train station. Do you know where it is? I smiled and pointed them in the right direction, explaining how to get there. My words weren't perfect. I stumbled over a few phrases, but they understood me. I had communicated in English, and they had understood me. As I walked away, I felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about speaking English. It was about stepping out of my comfort zone, about pushing through the fear that had held me back for so long. Every time I spoke, I was proving to myself that I could do this. I began to realize that these small victories were just as important, if not more important, than the big milestones. They were the building blocks of progress, the moments that kept me going when things got tough. Every time I understood a new word, every time I was able to follow a conversation without getting lost, every time I spoke without hesitation, those were the moments that mattered. In the past, I had always focused on the big picture. I wanted to be fluent in English, and anything less than that felt like failure. But now, I was learning to celebrate the small wins along the way. I was learning that progress wasn't about reaching the finish line. It was about the journey. Chapter 4. Overcoming the fear of speaking. For months, I had been battling my biggest fear: speaking English in public. It was a fear that had gripped me long before I stepped foot in an English class. The fear of speaking had always been more than just about words. It was about vulnerability, about putting myself out there for others to see and hear, about opening myself up to judgment and criticism. Every time I imagined speaking in front of a group, my stomach would twist into knots, and my mind would race with worst-case scenarios. But I knew that if I wanted to truly learn this language, I had to confront that fear. There was no other way. The fear of speaking wasn't new. It had been with me for as long as I could remember, stretching back to my childhood. I was always the quiet one, the observer, the person who sat in the back of the room and listened rather than participated. I was terrified of saying the wrong thing, of embarrassing myself in front of others. I never wanted to be the center of attention, and so I stayed quiet, blending into the background. That fear had followed me into adulthood, manifesting in different ways. At work, I avoided presentations and public speaking opportunities like the plague. In social situations, I would let others do the talking while I nodded along, too afraid to contribute my own thoughts. And now, as I was learning English, that fear had found a new form. The fear of speaking a language that wasn't my own. In my native language, I was shy but comfortable. I knew the words, the nuances, the expressions. But in English, everything felt foreign. The words felt heavy on my tongue, awkward and clumsy. I worried about my accent, about mispronouncing words, about not being understood. Every time I opened my mouth to speak English, it felt like I was putting a part of myself on display, and the thought of being judged for it was terrifying. But as the weeks turned into months, I realized that I couldn't avoid speaking forever. I had been hiding behind my fear for too long, and it was holding me back. I could see the progress my classmates were making. They were speaking more, participating in discussions, gaining confidence with each passing day. And while I had improved in many ways, my fear of speaking was still a barrier that I hadn't broken through. The turning point came during one of our speaking exercises in class. Mr. Harris had divided us into small groups, and we were supposed to practice giving short presentations to each other. The topic was simple, something we were passionate about, but the thought of standing up and speaking in front of my group filled me with dread. As my turn approached, I could feel the panic rising inside me. My heart was racing, my palms were sweaty, and my mind was going blank. I had prepared what I was going to say, but now, in the moment, all the words seemed to slip away. I wanted to run, to disappear, to do anything but speak in front of these people. But then something happened. As I stood there, frozen with fear, I looked around the room and realized that everyone else was just as nervous as I was. I wasn't the only one struggling. We were all learning, all making mistakes, all facing our own fears. And in that moment, something clicked inside me. I realized that I didn't have to be perfect. I didn't have to speak flawlessly. I just had to try. So when it was my turn, I took a deep breath and began. My voice was shaky, and I stumbled over my words, but I kept going. I talked about something I loved, something that mattered to me, and as I spoke I felt a shift inside me. The fear was still there, but it wasn't as powerful as before. I was speaking and that was enough. When I finished, my group clapped, and Mr. Harris smiled at me. "Great job," he said. "You did it." And in that moment, I realized something important. The fear wasn't going to go away overnight. But I could choose to speak anyway. I could choose to push through the fear, to face it head-on, and that was the only way I was going to get better. After that day, I made a promise to myself. I would speak every chance I got. No matter how scared I felt, no matter how many mistakes I made, I would speak. In class, I started volunteering to answer questions, even when I wasn't sure if my answer was correct. I participated in discussions, even when I was nervous about my pronunciation. Every time I spoke, it was a small victory, a step forward in my journey. The more I spoke, the more I realized that people weren't judging me the way I had feared. My classmates weren't sitting there, waiting for me to mess up. They were supportive, encouraging, and they were making mistakes too. We were all in this together, learning and growing at our own pace. Outside of class, I started challenging myself to speak English in everyday situations. I would order food in English at restaurants, even when I knew the staff spoke my native language. I would strike up conversations with tourists, offering to help them with directions or recommendations. At first, these interactions were nerve-wracking, and I still felt that familiar rush of anxiety every time I opened my mouth. But with each conversation, I felt my confidence growing. I began to realize that the fear of speaking was like a muscle. It could be strengthened over time. The more I exercised that muscle, the stronger it became. And while the fear never completely disappeared, it became more manageable. I learned to live with it, to push through it, and to speak anyway. The real test of my progress came when Mr. Harris announced that we would be giving short presentations in front of the entire class. Each of us would choose a topic, prepare a 5-minute speech, and present it to our classmates. The thought of standing up in front of everyone, speaking for 5 whole minutes, terrified me. It was one thing to speak in small groups, where the stakes felt lower. But in front of the whole class? That felt impossible. In the days leading up to the presentation, I was consumed with anxiety. I practiced my speech over and over again, trying to memorize every word, every sentence. I rehearsed in front of the mirror, watching my reflection as I stumbled over my words. I recorded myself speaking and listened to the playback, cringing at every mistake. The fear was overwhelming, and more than once, I thought about backing out. But I didn't. I knew that if I backed out now, I would be giving in to the fear, and I couldn't let that happen. I had come too far to quit now. When the day of the presentation arrived, I walked into the classroom feeling like I was walking to my own execution. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could barely breathe. As I waited for my turn, I could feel the panic rising inside me, threatening to take over. But then, something unexpected happened. As I watched my classmates give their presentations, I realized that they were nervous too. They weren't perfect. They made mistakes. But they kept going. And that gave me the courage I needed. When Mr. Harris called my name, I stood up, took a deep breath, and walked to the front of the room. My hands were shaking, and my voice was trembling, but I started speaking anyway. I had practiced my speech so many times that the words came naturally, almost without thinking. I talked about my journey learning English, about the fear I had faced, and about the small victories that had kept me going. As I spoke, I felt the fear slowly melting away. The more I talked, the more comfortable I became. I wasn't thinking about my mistakes or worrying about what my classmates thought of me. I was just speaking, sharing my story, and it felt liberating. When I finished, the room erupted in applause. My classmates were smiling, and Mr. Harris gave me a thumbs up from the back of the room. I had done it. I had faced my biggest fear, and I had survived. Chapter 6. The Courage to Speak. Overcoming Fear and Self-Doubt. Despite my progress, the journey was far from easy. The fear of speaking in front of others often gripped me tightly, like a cold hand around my throat. I could practice in front of the mirror, rehearse with friends, and write eloquent speeches. Yet the moment I stood before an audience, all my preparation would vanish, leaving me paralyzed by self-doubt. One significant experience stands out. A public speaking competition at my university. I had watched previous participants, captivated by their ability to articulate ideas with poise and confidence. As the date approached, I felt a surge of excitement mixed with dread. I wanted to participate, to challenge myself, but the fear of making a fool of myself loomed large. In the days leading up to the event, I practiced relentlessly. I crafted my speech, focusing on a topic that resonated deeply with me. The importance of embracing vulnerability in a world that often demands perfection. It was a topic I had grappled with, and I poured my heart into every word. Yet, as I practiced in front of friends, I could see the flicker of concern in their eyes when I stumbled over words or lost my train of thought. The night of the competition, the auditorium buzzed with energy. Participants paced nervously, clutching their notes. As my name was called, a wave of anxiety washed over me. I stepped onto the stage, and the bright lights felt like a spotlight revealing every flaw, every insecurity I carried. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of the journey I had embarked on. I thought of the countless hours spent immersing myself in English, the conversations I had navigated, and the writing that had shaped my voice. As I stood there, I realized that I was not just representing myself but all those who struggled with the same fears and insecurities. When I began to speak, my voice trembled at first. I could feel the audience's eyes on me, their expectations weighing heavily. But as I shared my story, my passion surged, and the words flowed more freely. I spoke of the power of vulnerability, how it connects us as humans, how it opens doors to understanding and compassion. With each sentence, I felt the fear dissipate, replaced by a sense of purpose. As I concluded my speech, the audience erupted into applause. I had shared a piece of my soul, and in doing so, I discovered that vulnerability is not a weakness. It's a source of strength. The fear that had once held me captive transformed into a powerful tool for connection. I left the stage exhilarated, my heart racing, knowing that I had taken a significant step toward conquering my fears. The aftermath of that experience was transformative. I began to seek opportunities to speak in public, embracing the discomfort that came with it. I joined a local Toastmasters club, where individuals gathered to practice their speaking skills in a supportive environment. I watched as others shared their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. Each meeting became a space for growth, a safe haven where I could explore my voice. Through the club, I learned techniques for managing anxiety, such as visualizing success and focusing on the message rather than myself. I practiced speaking in front of mirrors, recorded my speeches, and sought feedback from fellow members. Slowly but surely, the grip of fear began to loosen. I started to find joy in sharing my ideas and experiences, relishing the moments of connection with the audience. In one memorable session, I delivered a speech about the importance of embracing failure as a stepping stone to success. As I shared my own failures, the audience resonated with my story, nodding in understanding. Their smiles fueled my confidence, and I realized that vulnerability could bridge the gap between speaker and audience. As I continued to confront my fears, I learned that the key to overcoming self-doubt lies in the understanding that every speaker has faced similar challenges. Everyone stumbles, everyone has moments of uncertainty, and everyone has the potential to grow. This realization became my guiding light, encouraging me to push through discomfort and embrace opportunities for expression. With each speech I delivered, I felt more empowered. The fear that had once paralyzed me transformed into a source of inspiration. I began to approach speaking engagements with a sense of adventure, viewing them as opportunities to connect, share, and grow. I understood that language is not just a set of rules. It's a living, breathing entity that evolves through our interactions. Chapter 7. The Celebration of Mastery. Reflecting on the journey. As I look back on my language learning journey, I find myself enveloped in a whirlwind of emotions. Gratitude, pride, and awe at how far I have come. What began as a struggle to string together simple sentences has transformed into a profound understanding of a language that connects me to the world. The road was long and fraught with challenges, yet each obstacle became a stepping stone toward mastery. One evening, as I sat in a cozy cafe, sipping on a warm cup of tea, I reflected on my journey. The ambience was alive with the sound of laughter and conversation in various languages, but English felt like a familiar friend, wrapping me in its warmth. I could overhear snippets of discussions around me, and I found myself not just understanding but actively engaging with the language. It was a surreal moment, a testament to my growth. I remember the early days of hesitation when I first tried to converse with native speakers. Each interaction felt like climbing a mountain, and the fear of making mistakes loomed large. But now, I find joy in those conversations, embracing the mistakes as part of the learning process. The laughter that follows a mispronunciation is no longer a source of embarrassment but a shared moment of connection. I recall a particular day when I volunteered at a local charity event. Surrounded by volunteers and participants, I was tasked with giving a brief introduction in English. As I stood before the crowd, I felt a familiar flutter of nerves. But this time, I remembered the journey. The hours spent practicing, the struggles faced, and the resilience cultivated. I took a deep breath, and as I spoke, I felt a sense of empowerment. My words flowed naturally, and I could see the smiles on the faces around me. In that moment, I realized that I had truly become a part of the English-speaking community. But it wasn't just about speaking. Writing had also evolved into a powerful outlet for me. I had taken my love for storytelling to new heights, crafting essays and articles that resonated with others. My words became a bridge, allowing me to share my experiences, my passions, and my perspectives with a broader audience. Each piece I wrote was not just a reflection of my thoughts but a celebration of the language that had opened doors for me. I think back to the countless hours spent immersed in English literature, dissecting the prose, appreciating the beauty of metaphors, and unraveling the intricacies of character development. I found myself lost in worlds crafted by brilliant authors, and through their narratives, I discovered my own voice. The realization that I could also weave my stories into the fabric of language was exhilarating. As I continued to write, I started submitting my work to online publications and literary platforms. The first time I received an acceptance email was a moment of triumph. My heart raced as I read the words, "We would love to feature your piece." It felt like a dream come true, a validation of my journey and a reminder that my voice mattered. Each published piece became a stepping stone, propelling me further into the realm of storytelling. With each article, I felt a growing responsibility to share my experiences authentically. I knew that my journey was not just my own but one that resonated with many others. I began to receive messages from readers who shared their struggles, their fears, and their aspirations. The connections forged through writing were profound, reminding me of the beauty of shared experiences. The support from my newfound community was a source of encouragement. Readers expressed gratitude for the stories I shared, for the vulnerability I embraced in my writing. Their feedback fueled my desire to continue sharing, to inspire others who were on their own journeys of language learning and self-discovery. I learned that writing was not just about self-expression. It was about creating a space for connection and understanding. As I reflected on my journey, I understood that the mastery of language was not an endpoint but a continuous process. Each day brought new opportunities to learn, to grow, and to connect. I found joy in exploring different dialects, understanding cultural nuances, and expanding my vocabulary. The world of English was vast, and I was only beginning to scratch the surface. I started attending workshops and language exchange meetups, where I could engage with others passionate about language. The atmosphere was electric, filled with laughter, ideas, and stories waiting to be shared. Each conversation became a thread weaving a rich tapestry of experiences. I cherished the diversity of voices, each bringing unique perspectives and insights. As I participated